Thanks a lot, Thilo, for this very kind introduction and for setting up this mini symposium, which is very nice. I hope to contribute to the success of this event. And as you told, actually, my focus will be mainly exactly on up and down slow oscillations and how this up and down slow oscillation actually can display some metastability, contributing to the richness of the cortical dynamics when you move from the unconscious state to the conscious one. So when you move from anesthesia or sleep and wake up from this state being once again conscious. And as we are speaking about metastability, I think that a good starting point might be this canonical circuit introduced in spiking neural networks by Daniel Amit and Nicolas Brunel, and has been used to model working memory, so short-term memory. And the idea in this case that under Millfield approximation, a network of spiking neurons composed of excitatory and inhibitory neurons, like in this case, with strong enough self-excitation, synaptic self-excitation in a small subset of neurons, the foreground, can display nonlinear dynamics, and particularly attractor dynamics. And this is an example of what is happening whenever you change the strength of the excitation, the synaptic excitation, which brings to have a symmetry breaking in which the network, when the coupling is weak, you have only one attractive state at the low firing rate. But if you increase this self-excitation, you will end up to have two stable attractors, one at the low firing rate and the other at high firing rates, which can be depicted by this Lyapunov function. This effective energy landscape has two valleys. And depending on the simulation, you will be driven to go in one of these two states, and you can escape from this metastable states. This is a canonical circuit because actually does not only describe the dynamics of a convenient function like the working memory or short-term memory, but actually if you put together many of these canonical circuits, you can build a network displaying global transition that are has been successfully used to describe what is going on in cortical areas when other cognitive functions can be performed. And an example is shown here with this. This is a very classic paper by Shinoy and collaborator, where they look at the latent space of the activity in motor cortices when a monkey is performing a reaching task. And these are the trajectories, the gray curves. The trajectory follows by these neurons in an effective latent subspace when the animal moves from one behavioral state to another. For instance, when the go-to appears on the screen and then the animal moves, and all the trajectories represent moving in a different state. And this can be described as a coordinated activity of many of the cortical circuits I showed before. And we did a contribution to this description in which actually these trajectories are the result of a kind of chain reaction in which these bistable networks are eliciting some switches in other and so on and so forth. And so this is metastability in this sense, and there are plenty of other examples related to this kind of dynamical phenomenon, which in the end underlies many cognitive functions. But what I will focus on in this talk is a particular state, the one we experience every day when we go to sleep. And in this case, if you pick an you stick an electrode inside the brain. This is the classical picture coming from Steria, the work. They recorded intracortically from a cat, and simultaneously they also recorded the EEG recordings, which are the top traces. In the end, this is instead the intercellular recordings from a neuron in the visual cortex, if I remember, from a cat. And you see that this animal is falling asleep exactly at this point. And before this, you see that the spiking activity of these single neurons are rather irregular. the EEG signal is has small fluctuations and it is rather asynchronous. But when the animal falls asleep, you start to see very large fluctuations in the EEG signal in both hemispheres. So this couple of signals coming from one hemisphere and this from the other hemisphere. So it's a global phenomenon involving the whole brain. And the whole brain at different scales. Indeed, if you have a look now at what is happening at the level of the single cell, you start to see a period of hyperpolarized state, which are named down state, in which the neurons are almost silent. And then they are followed by an activated state, the up state, or on state, as if you prefer, in which the member potential is depolarized and the neuron starts to fire again. These are the up state. And you see that this oscillation moving from down to up, are very much synchronized across the whole brain. And you can describe this kind of phenomenon having a look to the detailed time course of the firing rate from intracortical recordings. This is an example coming from the Mami Sanchez-Vives lab in Barcelona. This is a work we've done together. And you can see that whenever you stick an electrode with several contacts inside the cortex, you see that this up and down oscillation, this is a single cycle, both from the perspective of the local field potential and the multi-unit activity, which is a lamp signal telling you how many spikes are produced by a cell assembly nearby the electrode per unit time. You start to see that in particular in layer 5, it is rather apparent that there is a big increase of firing rate when this column is in the upstate. And if you zoom in and you average across several upstate, you see that this is the average shape of the cycle down, up, down at the level of the synchronous state induced by anesthesia in this case. If I remember, this is ketamine anesthesia. And what is nice here is that if you have a look to the distribution of the multi-unity, so the firing rate of the cell assembly, you start to see that distribution is bimodal. And the residence time in the down and in the up, at least under this condition, anesthetic condition, are relatively regular. This is the distribution of the duration of the up, red, and the down states. So this is a very reminiscent of an example of a metastable state. And having a look to how to model this alternation between down and up, you can recover what I discussed at the beginning, because the canonical cortical circuit actually, thanks to the fact that you have a strong synaptic excitation, allows to describe very well the transition from down to up, because the transition down to up is not a kind of chain reaction induced by the fact that the coupling is strong. And this is what is happening in this small time window. Now, if you can imagine that these are the single neurons of a cell assembly we are sampling, and whenever one of them by chance start to fire this red, it will deliver this activity through synaptic transmission to others, and then a chain reaction starts. This is the reason why you have this very stereotyped and sudden transition from down to up, which under mean field description, as discussed before, can be represented as a downhill pathway from the down state towards the up in this bistable dynamics. But if you look now at the other phase of this cycle, the one where you have up state moving towards the down, you see that actually an important player is missing. You need some inhibition in order to kill the stability of the up state in order to have such regular duration of the up and down states. Of course, this is not always the case. For instance, in other sleep, as I guess we will see later, the variability of these up and down states are rather large. But it is important in order to model this activity to introduce another ingredient. And the ingredient is a kind of self-inhibition, which represent the fatigue of this network. In this cycle, up-down cycle, where the blue means the firing rate of the pool and the red represent the level of fatigue, you see that you have a maximum fatigue at the end of the up state, and then there is a kind of recovery period during the down state. This red state variable is associated to the phenomenon of spike frequency adaptation. And this level of fatigue in the end under mean field approximation can be very well described as an inhibitory feedback. Let's say that this is the very rough representation of the dynamics of the firing rate of this pool of neurons I'm investigating. This is the input-output gain function, let's say the Sigurd-Ricciardi gain function, which depends on the input currents. Input currents which are synaptic currents, mainly due by the activity of the network and due to the level of this fatigue. Stronger is this parameter G, which tells you how strong is the feedback, and easier will be to kill the up state. This is an example, for instance, you have a downward transition, and if the G, the strength of fatigue, is not strong enough, there is an adaptation in the firing rate, but this adaptation doesn't destabilize the up state. This is not the case when you move from a condition in which you have a stronger adaptation. Indeed, stronger is the adaptation and shorter is the up state duration. This additional ingredients actually leads to have a different shaping of the Lyapunov function in such a way the up states start to be unstable, and then you have a downhill descent from this valley to the other state. So this is a classical way to describe this phenomenon, that once you assume that the typical timescales of the firing rate dynamics is much slower than the adaptation timescales, as in this case, this is very well represented by a relaxation oscillator, where you have now 2 degrees of freedoms, which is adaptation on the x-axis and firing rate on the y-axis, and the adaptation slowly change the NLG landscape, the Lyapunov function of the system, in such a way you will destabilize and restabilize the up and down valleys, corresponding valleys. So this is the very simple way to describe this slow oscillation at the level of single unit. Okay. Once you have this 2 variable, actually, you see that this 2 degree of freedom are capable to describe also the different regimes this network is capable to express. And for instance, you can describe simply changing the strength of adaptation in this bifurcation diagram, the fact that you move from a burst suppression-like regime in which the activity is almost silent, and then you reduce adaptation and you start to see these sparse in time up states, regular slow oscillation when the adaptation is weaker again, until you come up, when you cross the border, this transition and this state, which is reminiscent of the synchronized state of awake-like desynchronized state. So this is a very simple picture that captures all the richness offered by this state. But you have to consider that slow oscillations are a global phenomenon that involves all the brain. This is an example of recordings coming again from the Mavis lab, in which each row is a channel on top of the cortex, and this is the way in which the upstate occur. Upstate actually occur as waves. You can see here these waves are how they occur, and depending on the level of anesthesia, actually these waves are shaped in a different way. In particular, when the anesthesia starts to be lighter, you see that the frequency of this slow oscillation is higher, and not only, also the pattern of this wave start to be more rich. This means that actually when you move towards the border that separates slow oscillations, low wave activity, and the awake-like state, actually start to have spontaneous activity which is richer. And this richness is described again, resorting to mean field theories, as a synchronized phase transition, in which again the critical parameter is the adaptation. In such a way you can move when you have this field of neurons connected together, showing silent state, bar suppression, regular, almost regular up and down slow oscillation in this case. And when you approach the critical point, the border between the yellow and the white areas, you start to see that there appears some long up states, and the interval between up states are more irregular. Of course, when you cross this border, you start to see the asynchronous irregular state, which is the one associated to the desynchronized state leading to consciousness. Okay, and if you come back to this macroscopic level, at the level of the cell assembly, actually you see that this richness is characterized by something that is once again metastable dynamics. And this is an experiment in which the rats are anesthetized with ketamine. Again, we have a silicon probe in the visual cortex. We focus on the activity of layer 5 pyramidal neurons. And what you see on the right is the local field potential at different level of anesthesia. Here, anesthesia is ketamine, methamphetamine, and the fading out of this anesthesia leads the spontaneous activity you record from this cortical column, let's say, from a deep stage 1, deep stage 2, and then a light anesthesia level, which show a peculiar footprint. So when you are very deep, the oscillations are irregular, as in this case. Then, as the anesthesia lightens, you see that this oscillation starts to be regular. But at some point, at this point, when light 1 label can be observed, you start to see also another rhythm. This is the spectrogram of the local field potential. And you see that the regularity of the delta rhythm is associated to the width of this resonant peak. So shorter is, more regular is the oscillation. But the appearance of this second peak is telling you that there is another rhythm. A rhythm which is at the infraslow oscillation, as we say, and this infraslow oscillation are ranging at 0.5 or even less. And under this condition, you start to see this pattern. You see that there are slow oscillation and then irregular activity, slow oscillation, irregular activity. And the pace of the jumping from the synchronized and synchronized state is at this infraslow frequency. Okay, so this is the evidence. These are known as gamma bursts, are also observed in humans, and we will see that actually this is tightly related to what has been observed also under natural sleep. But to make the story short, this alternation between slow oscillation and the synchronized state is not only observed at the level of local field potential, but also at the level of multi-unit activity. So it's a local firing rate that displays this asynchronous activity, which is named microarousal, because this is very asynchronous, desynchronized as in the wake state, and the slow oscillation. So there is this alternation, rather regular. And we have been able to model and to predict some footprints. I will not tell you this because of the lack of time. Again, resorting to the bifurcation diagram I showed before. And in this case, what we changed was both the level of excitation on the x-axis and the level of adaptation, because these are a very good way to represent how the fading out of this kind of anesthesia is occurring. Okay, once you approach this critical point, the one separating the slow oscillation phase and the asynchronous wake-like state, you start to see that the slow oscillation are sparse, irregular, then start to be regular, and you start to see this alternation between the microarousal and slow oscillation. But why this? Well, this is because actually we are inducing the model an external perturbation, which is sinusoidal at the frequency of infraslow oscillation. And this is a very tiny perturbation, a tiny input we should provide to the network. Why? Because we are close to a critical point. And the critical point has the advantage to be maximally sensitive, having long-range correlation, and everything is in contact with each other. And so a very tiny perturbation can elicit a transition from two available states: a limit cycle, the slow oscillation, the relaxation oscillator, and the microarousal, which is an equilibrium point, a stable focus. Indeed, we confirmed this under near-field approximation. We found that this region where we have L2 is this case, is where you have, so we are moving in this direction. You have on the left only slow oscillation. So this is the tip at the bottom of the slow oscillation in the firing rate. And on the right, you have only one fixed point. Right, I'm almost finished. And you see that here you have a limit cycle coexisting with an equilibrium point. And this is the place in the bifurcation diagram where you can have this alternation between microarousals and slow oscillation. An autonomous system can be designed in order to produce this nested oscillation. And this is simply obtained, again, having the canonical circuit with adaptation I showed before, coupled with another element, which is likely modeling the brainstem, where is implemented all the machinery related to circadian rhythms. So the machinery that is governing the transition from sleep to wake and coming back to it, okay? So if you have a look to the activity and then to the current provided by the brainstem in this model, you see that whenever you have slow oscillation, there is an increase of this current. So there is a kind of accumulation of activity. And then you have a destabilization of the slow oscillation state, and such that only the microarousal is there. Under this condition, you have a relaxation of this current. And then you have, once again, the next cycle. So you have a bouncing, no? A nested cycle. So a slow cycle like this one, showing this long cycle, together with the very fast slow oscillation on this phase and the asynchronous state on this other phase. The properties of this cycle can be simply governed by changing the level of excitability, the external current you can provide to the cortex. Indeed, when this input, excitable input, is strong, you are making more stable the microarousal. And this is the case when you are approaching wakefulness and the microarousal are longer. On the other hand, when this level of excitability, the degree of wakefulness is weak, you start to have the opposite, a very long period of slow oscillation, a very short period of microarousal. This is just to tell you that, again, this is a very nice example. As I told you, from the experience, we also tested this hypothesis of the existence of these two attractors, finding many proof of the reliability of this theoretical description, that is telling you that there is another kind of metastability. So there are several metastability that are differently expressed depending on the global states of the brain. And in this case, we found that this alternation between slow oscillation, here we have the EEG patterns coming from a human brain, are interspersed by microarousal naturally. And by Parino Tersano here in Italy, they introduced the concept of cyclic alternative pattern. The cyclic alternative pattern is the proof that the sleep is unstable. And this instability is due to the fact of this competition between a limit cycle, as I described to you, competing with a stable focus in this simple matter. And just to wrap up and to tell you which are the key messages, the take-home message is, okay, the metastability of cortical networks resorting to a generalization and enrichment of the canonical circuits which we used to model perceptual decision or short-term memory actually has to be enriched with an additional current, which is the potassium current associated to spike frequency adaptation or short-term depression, so short synaptic depression, okay? And thanks to name field approaches, we can describe a very simple bifurcation diagram that allows us to describe this transition from sleep to wake or from deep anesthesia to wake. This transition is a specific phase transition, which is the synchronized phase transition. And at that point, you have a subcritical of bifurcation where coexist these two local state, the slow oscillation and the microarousal. And I conclude, of course, thanking all the collaborators that contributed to the work I showed and the funding coming from the Human Brain Project, and of course you for your attention and Tilo for the organization of this nice workshop. Thank you.
Thank you, Maurizio, for this very nice talk. There's time for only one very short question. You can just unmute yourself if you have a question and directly speak into. Yeah. Otherwise, I would like to know about a little bit more about the model. So this is a rate model, or is it a network model of integrated fire neurons, or is how do you add noise? Because sometimes I see some stochasticity in the traces. And I wonder whether this potential that you show is more like for illustration, or whether you can indeed have a potential system.
Thanks for
was
the
already
question.
a long question, but
yes, it's a long question, and actually
it's
a very intriguing question, because as you can understand, that as we are speaking about metastability, the role of noise is important. And actually, the way in which, so these are mean field rate models. We introduce the finite size fluctuations in a very simplistic way. So these fluctuations are related to the finite size of the network. Let me tell you that the statistics of the residence time in the slow oscillation and microarousal state should be strongly related to the size of this fluctuation, so to the size of the network underlying. So let me say that also we are expecting to see phenomena like stochastic resonance, and in particular, this might be also a way to estimate the size of the local circuits in some way.
Okay, so maybe because of time, we need to move on. But thank you again.